I project and the speaker, that's really bad. So I'm Jeni Tennison. I'm the Technical Director and the Deputy CEO at the Open Data Institute, based out of London. Welcome to this final session of the day, which is a session on policy and the ways in which we can take some of the research that has been done and some of the thoughts that have been spoken about over the rest of this conference into a policy arena. How can we help influence what governments are doing in order to regulate the handling of user data? What are our thoughts from the research that we've done about what they should be doing? What kinds of policies should we be expecting companies to put together in order to promote transparency and trust from their users? What are the kinds of challenges that we get when we're working across jurisdictions, and particularly between the US and the EU? And how can we expect what other research might we want to do in order to inform policy making more generally? These are the kinds of questions that we're going to be talking about in this session. I'm going to start us by just having a little word with the various members of the panel here. And then we'll go to the floor for questions later on. So please, as you're listening, do think of questions that you'd like to ask of this panel. So I'm not going to introduce them in any great depth, just to say that this is Enrique, this is Mei-Lin, this is Markus, and on the screen, eventually, you should see in small, he's very, very small, and now in a kind of, woo, that's Christian there. We're zooming in on your picture, Christian. So we're actually going to go to Christian first of all. So Christian, can you give us a little bit of background about yourself, just introduce yourself, and also you come from OECD, and you recently published a book called Data-Driven Innovation, Big Data for Growth and Wellbeing, and I'm hoping that you'll tell us a bit about that book and what you found from it.
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, good. So I've decided to use a couple of slides in order to share with you the result of our report on data-driven innovation. So let me share, try to share my screen with you. Let's see if it works. I think by now you should be...
Yep.
Okay. So maybe I should say a little bit about the OECD. So this is a, can you see my slides?
We can see like the top left corner of your slides.
Okay, that's strange. Let me try again. Maybe I can't.
That looks better.
Is it better?
Yep. Yes, very good. It's working.
Okay. So the OECD is an intergovernmental organization. We have 34 member countries, many of them including European countries. But as you can see in the list, we have also countries like the United States and Canada, also Mexico in Americas, but also countries in Asia like Japan and Korea, to just highlight a few. So we are developing policy standards. And we are also working in a multi-stakeholder approach, which is kind of what distinguishes us from the UN, as to give one example. So I mentioned the report, or you mentioned the report on data-driven innovation. It has a couple of key chapters. And what I would like to highlight, which is relevant, I think, to the discussion in this particular event, is drawn from two chapters, chapter 4 and 5, on data as an infrastructure, and also the key issues around trust, including privacy, but also cybersecurity. as well as the last 4 chapters, which are looking at the application of data in key application areas. Very briefly, what we are talking about is really the use of data and analytics in order to innovate. So this is really about the development of new products, processes, and organizational methods. I think I would like to go directly to the key point, which is the fact that we see that data can be reused across different sectors and for different purposes. And I think this is really one of the key kind of messages that we try to convey to policymakers. And it's really about the reuse. Why is it important? Because we basically have highlighted data as being an infrastructure. And we try to convey to policymakers that they shouldn't look at data as a new oil, as it's often proclaimed, but really more as an infrastructure. And the reason for this is for 3 main reasons. The one is we see data as being a non-frivolous good, meaning that you can reuse data without diminishing its value to others. And this basically calls for what we call non-discriminatory access in order to maximize the value of data. Another key property is that we see that data is a capital. And this is really a kind also something people wouldn't consider. Why is it important? Because we see that the value of data doesn't necessarily come from its, if you want, from the pure sake of itself being used. But the question here is, for what type of purposes are we using it? And in particular, for what further production are we using that data? And the last one, and this is really important, it's about data as a general purpose input. And this is really important, in particular, when we think about the privacy issues that comes with that, because as you all know, one of the key principles in many privacy regimes is the purpose specification principle, which basically say that data controllers must specify the intended use before collecting and using the data. And we see that this is kind of colliding with some of the key economic properties of data, which is exactly that you can reuse it for many different purposes, and many of those purposes you may not actually anticipate initially when you did collect the data. So with that comes one particular tension, and I think this is really relevant for the audience in this particular event. And this is the tension that comes with the benefits of openness, as we call it, and the benefit and the preferences of individuals for closeness. I may need to explain a little bit more what we mean by openness, because this is not really just about open data, but it's more openness in a more abstract sense. What you see here now are different attributes or application, if you want, or issues that promote and lead to more openness. I've already mentioned multi-purpose reuse of data. Obviously, open data is about opening up data. But if you think about data portability, for instance, or data sharing, or open APIs, or open standards, or open algorithmic transparencies, these are all factors leading to more openness in what we call the data ecosystem. And with that comes more economic spillovers or positive externalities. On the other hand, you have some attributes that basically favor closeness in that sense. So that for individuals, but also businesses, are key properties that why they want to keep the data close to themselves. And one obviously is privacy or confidentiality. But if you look at businesses, they themselves have some reasons why they want to keep their data closed. And one is they want to keep the users logged in. They want to create data wallet gardens. Sometimes they will also give digital security as another reason to keep the data closed. And one important factor is also intellectual property rights, including trade secrets. And those 2 dimensions of our poles are really spanning a continuum between which policymakers need to strike the right balance. And this is really challenging. And if I may just point to give you 3 examples. I already mentioned multi-purpose reuse versus privacy as being kind of a natural tension. But if you think about data portability and user logins, very often businesses will say, and also in particular investors will look at how businesses can keep users logged into their system in order to determine how profitable those businesses will be. So businesses have a natural tendency to want to keep users logged in. On the other hand, policymakers are looking at data portability as a way not only to free up and overcome user login, but also as a way to promote competition. Or if you look at algorithmic transparency, you see that this is really clashing the business's interest for keeping the intellectual property rights protected. These are the key summaries of our, or the key policy consideration of our report. And the one highlighted in red are really the one that are directly related to the points that I just made. I think the one that I would like to highlight is the last point, where we really call for governments to have a whole of government strategic approach when it comes to leverage data for innovation. And we suggest that they should look at data as we used to look at research and development for innovation. And with that comes a number of implications, and I'm sure we can discuss this during the discussion. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Christian. So that gave us a really good overview about the kinds of tensions that we can see at a large-scale economic scale. So when you're looking at a nation trying to make a decision about its policies. I'm going to turn to Enrique next, and I'm hoping that you can give us a bit of insight from the research that Telefónica has done about, on a small scale, what users expect in terms of the management of their data and what organizations do with it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeni. Thanks for having me today in this, I think really important conference that helps to the consolidation of the Data Transparency Lab, in which, by the way, sit in that far corner there. I've been trying to learn a lot. Sometimes I just understand the words, but not the whole sentence of the phrases. But I'm only a lawyer. Sorry. First of all, let me give just a little hint of Telefónica. We are a telecommunications provider in the more traditional sense of the concept, operating basically in Europe and Latin America, and serving around 300 billion customers in both continents. Yes, we've been doing lately a research and a piece of public positioning on data. And what is the reason? I mean, for us, for example, to see this suddenly. For us, data, as we've been normally bound by rules which prevented us to use data in whatever way, was obviously the third, or had the characteristics of the third of the three that we've seen in the previous slides. It was a general purpose issue with no intrinsic value. Suddenly, the boom of the digital era comes, everything changes. And we are looking, as a telco company, we are looking at a totally different environment. Our main concerns in terms of what products and services do we put in the market and who is our competitor in order to provide those products and services are not anymore the Vodafones or the Deutsche Telekoms or the AT&Ts of the world, but suddenly it's Google, Facebook, Amazon, all the big and small players in the internet arena, the ones that are taking advantage of that new business, which is all the business created around the internet. So suddenly we see with a shock that data is similar to our networks, non-rival roads, and it can be a bottleneck to access the business in internet, and also a capital which we don't know how to manage. So in order to try to first from a positioning point of view, try to set up our minds and do whatever we had to do. A couple of years ago, or 1.5 years ago, we launched what we call the Telefónica Digital Manifesto. The Telefónica Digital Manifesto sets our public positioning of a telco company as Telefónica in the internet era. We devote one of the chapters of this digital manifesto to what we call digital confidence. Basically, that the digital confidence we want to create that digital confidence through a safer internet experience and empowering citizens to be in control of their personal data. People presented here, or like ODI or Sandy Pentland, have made contributions, or their ideas are reflected in the digital manifesto, so they have influenced our public positioning, and for us is very important. In that digital manifesto, we did some research that I want to update today, because as I said before, it was 1.5 years ago. But let me point out of our research 4 points that to what we call customers and not users, because I mean we have a commercial relation with them, are the main concerns regarding personal data. So the good thing for us is there is a certain level of trust on communication service providers to manage data or personal information from people. We are clearly in that level of trust below banks, leveled more or less, sometimes ahead, sometimes below, to governments, which is sometimes also amazing, but it depends on the geographies. I'm trying to put a general note, and sometimes below utilities also, which is also quite amazing. And normally we are above in the level of trust of other internet providers and social networks. There is nevertheless a willingness to share data if it improves products and services recommendation. So the data which there is less hunger to share is location, medical and healthcare data, and financial data at the bottom of it. But there is a, which I may find also amazing. There is some hunger in providing or no problem, no concerns in the list of less concerns. There is demographic data, including ethnic groups, lifestyle, media usage, and even identification data. Third point that I want to point out is there is absolute hunger, or there is the conscious or the idea that if you provide your data, you need to get something in return. Among the preferences of the customers to get in return, it's free products and services, free content, free airtime, and the less valued, which is also quite amazing from what we've seen here, it's advertisement recommendations. And finally, customers want to be in control. So they want to be informed of what data you collect. They want to be asked for permission. They want to know what you do with it. And they want to be able to restrict the usage. So in conclusion, and I'll let the other panelists talk now, I would say that it's a general view accepted by customers that the disclosure of personal data has to be accepted, and it is an accepted practice to get products or services in the internet world. But there is a will to have certain level of control, which is, I think, for all of you guys, as the products that you are designing and providing to the internet arena, provide control, which is something decided by the customers.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn now to Markus, if you'll do a little intro for yourself as well. And perhaps you can talk about how in an environment where technology is changing so quickly, the law can keep up with those changes and how it needs to change.
Certainly, thank you, Jeni. My name is Markus Heyder. I am with the Center for Information Policy Leadership, a global privacy policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. and in London. I'm based in Washington. I've been with the center for about 1.5 years. Before that, I was an attorney at the FTC for 12 years doing global privacy policy and enforcement work. Before that, I was in private practice for about 8 years with large international law firms. So turning to your question about whether law can provide the relevant protection in the face of constant change of technology and the quickness of changes that we're experiencing, I think the short answer is, of course, it cannot. And it has to be supplemented by additional tools to protect consumers effectively and to enable innovative uses of data. So law can do a few things. It can provide high-level principles. It can set certain standards. And it can provide for processes that enable coming to the right decision around certain data processing in a given context. But it can't be granular and define what you have to do with data forever. If it tries to do that, which some regimes do, it'll quickly run into trouble. It either prevents effective use of data or undercuts privacy. So laws themselves are not sufficient. But there is good news because we have by now well-developed tools and concepts that enable companies and organizations to come up with the appropriate contextual privacy protections as technology develops and as business practices develop. And that's called, or can be described as corporate or organizational accountability. And corporate accountability simply refers to a process or a group of core elements and practices that companies can undertake to ensure privacy and effective and responsible use of data. Key ingredients of organizational accountability are defined in various documents and guidance by data protection authorities and other organizations around the world. By now, essentially, the ingredients are privacy risk assessments, privacy by design, comprehensive policies and practices that apply to the entire data information cycle, oversight, training, monitoring, risk analysis, importantly, risk assessment, privacy risk analyses with respect to data processing initiatives, and importantly for this conference, transparency is also an essential ingredient of accountability. These schemes or these programs can be implemented by organizations individually on a case-by-case basis, mapping their internal framework to outside legal requirements, or by participating in recognized accountability schemes such as the EU binding corporate rules and the APEC cross-border privacy rules, which are essentially codes of conduct, also known as accountability schemes, that give companies the granular tools to come up with the right result in a given context in terms of how to use data, how not to use data, what mitigations and controls to implement. So the answer to the question is law is not enough. It can do certain things, set standards, and provide for processes, but it has to be accompanied and supplemented by accountability frameworks that companies adopt for their information practices.
Cool, thank you. And so if I can characterize that in a little bit of a different way, then there's the principles from law. Then we have layered over the top of it the transparency from companies, and then layered over the top of that maybe the user controls that individuals can actually help to tweak.
Yes, I think the accountability tools, risk assessments and transparency, essentially mainly risk assessments, will define what user controls you develop. So right. You have to first assess the proposed data processing initiative, your new product or service, and then determine based on the risk and the sensitivity to the consumer what kind of user control is needed, wanted, or able to exist, and then create those user controls. So.
Thank you. So Mei-Lin, we'll turn to you now, a late addition to our panel. So you work for the People-Centered Internet. Would you tell us a bit about that initiative and what you're trying to do there?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Mei-Lin Fang. I'm originally from Singapore. I like to call it the first people-powered economy. And I'm currently working with Vince Cerf on the People-Centered Internet. So what's the story behind all of this? I was one of the pioneers of CRM, customer relationship management, when I worked at Oracle. I imagined that technology could support human relationships between a business and a customer. And over the course of the next 15 years, I saw businesses use the technology that we imagined to actually manipulate customers and to manage them into places where, if you can just think of how we dreaded calling call centers, you can imagine how appalled I was that the original things that we came up with were being used in such an anti-human way. What we see now, and why I joined forces with Vint Cerf, is that for him, the internet was about improving people's lives, about helping people have an opportunity where they didn't have before. And so he's over 70 now. He's the technology evangelist at Google. But this is a private initiative he's taking in order to make sure that the legacy of the internet is really of the people, by the people, and for the people. Because of this, we are joining forces and working with all of you at the Data Transparency Lab to let you know, Wayne Gretzky talked about you have to skate to where the puck is. Where is the puck going? Singapore is an example of a very planned economy. It's kind of driven by math and law. It went from poverty-stricken 50 years ago. This is the 50th anniversary of Singapore. And it is now at GDP per capita of 20% higher than the US. Could I get the slide up? Okay. Oh, no, the next one. The next one. So because of that, Singapore is seeing the opportunity to actually understand data at the population level. Up to now, we have not had the ability to really do research at the population level. Perhaps that data is only available at places like the World Bank. So what Vint and I put together was the Secretariat for the People-Centered Internet. And the next one. Thank you, sorry. I actually wanted the photo. So we brought together the World Bank, the US State Department, representatives from the Department of Defense. The feeling is that we have an opportunity in our lifetimes to actually affect all the generations after us, because this is the first time we globally connect as a global community. And how we do it is very, very important. I was actually in Paris on the 13th of November. I was in lockdown in a restaurant, waiting to be let out because of the attacks. It made me realize how important the work that we're doing is, because if we connect people, but we don't give them access to the social connections and the financial networks and the opportunities that we have, they will be candidates for attacking us. So it's important both from a defense point of view, but also just from a human dignity and respect point of view. So we came together in this gathering at Stanford University 3 weeks ago, bringing a number of people from different communities, the hacker and maker space, Wikipedia, IBM, Cisco, Ericsson, in order to understand what could we do together. The background I bring to this, beyond all of the stuff I've talked about, is that I worked with the US Department of Defense on the future of health. And this was at a time when the whole mess of the Accountability Care Act was going through. And so people were really struggling in the federal departments on the day-to-day issues. And what we did was we actually looked 20 or 30 years into the future and said, what do we want? How do we want health to work? And it actually came down to healthy communities, that no one individual can control their health. But within your neighborhood, you have much more control. Let me just give an example. If you have diabetes and you're supposed to do a special diet, if your whole family is involved and they all change how they eat, it becomes much more easy and natural to adjust. So doing things beyond the individual level is very important. And what we're saying is that the Data Transparency Lab and all the things that you all are doing, consider the kind of research that you can do at the population level, at the community level, at the family level, at the neighborhood block level, because we can make much more impact. Social determinants of health affect 85% of health outcomes, yet all our research today, almost all our research, is into the 15% of clinical interventions. The payoff for humanity, should we look at things at the population level, is huge. So I'm working with the Stanford Center for Population Health Sciences to begin to bring health data, population data, and we are now joining forces with the World Bank to understand what are the policy and research initiatives that are required to really move the needle on human well-being and thriving?
Lovely. So before I open the floor to questions, which I'll do in just a minute, I just wondered if each of you, we've talked about individual control, we've talked about the need for communities to come together, we've talked about the responsibility that commercial companies have about their users. We've also talked about the responsibility that governments have to take care of the data infrastructure and the general way in which data is used. So I was going to ask each of you, what do you think is the right balance between those things? Who should be acting most forcefully? Is it us as a community? Is it all down to governments? Should companies be stepping forward and being accountable and being more transparent? Should we put all the onus on individual users? Christian, I wondered if you would like to kick us off. How does this play into your thoughts about data as infrastructure? If you're there.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think, obviously, this is a complex landscape because you have many different actors involved. I think where we definitely need to do a little bit more, and I think the technical community can do a lot, is think about how can we empower the individuals? How can we provide them the necessary tools in order for them to take control over their own personal data? And I think here, policymakers have also a role to play. I've highlighted the potential that comes with data portability. The reason for that is really because I think that a lot of the discussion, or when we think about privacy, we should also think about other regulatory issues such as competition. And I think data portability is an interesting way how to address and empower the individuals to take control over the data, and at the same time promote competition, which may lead, and I think there are promises signed that this may be the case, which may lead in businesses looking a little bit more into providing privacy-friendly enhanced services. So I would go for more empowerment of the individuals as being a key issue where we need to do a little bit more than we have done in the past. And this includes policies as well as the technical empowerment of individuals. And I've heard some of the presentation today, and it seems to be that the community that has presented today is also thinking about that type of empowerment.
Markus, yeah.
I think empowering the individual is very important, and a lot of transparency work goes to enabling individual empowerment, individual choices, consent, and so forth. That's the traditional privacy protection model. But I do think in the modern information age, there are going to be more and more circumstances and situations where the consumer, the user, can no longer make choices on a case-by-case basis about what happens with their data. So we have to develop a world that is appropriate for that and a framework for that. And I think, just to give you an analogy, we're all excited about driverless cars, and we're waiting for them, and it's going to happen. But we also need to think about driverless privacy, not from a user's perspective. I mean, the cars are going, from a user's perspective, driverless. Of course, privacy will be driven then by companies, the responsible organizations, software developers, and in combination with regulators and policymakers. So it's somebody's driving, but not necessarily the consumer. We cannot burden the consumer on a day-to-day basis with making responsible and informed choices in this complex modern information landscape. So transparency has different functions. The first function is to enable informed choices where possible. The other function is to create a general level of trust and awareness among the public about what data is being used for, what the value exchange is, and we heard about that earlier this morning. What is the value, the exchange, what is the value proposition by organizations when they interact with consumers and take their data? If consumers understand what happens to their data, the beneficial uses that come from it, and how society benefits, they might be willing to accept sharing their data without being involved in every step along the way. So transparency can have the role of building trust and confidence and a level of acceptance that information is being used for good purposes, and a lot more goes into that. Organizations have to show that they're accountable, how they're protecting the data, ways to intervene if necessary, or if consumers nevertheless want to become involved. But generally, I would think we need to shift the burden somewhat from the consumer to the organizations that use the data in combination with sensible laws and regulations.
Thank you. Mei-Lin?
Yes, I want to jump in because I think it's a little bit of a false dichotomy to say it's the individual or the organizations. There are actually networks that allow a single individual to be as smart as the whole network they're part of. And this was actually the thesis of Douglas Engelbart. So Engelbart, when he invented the mouse, really imagined the social networks we have today. But that was 45 years ago in 1968, the mother of all demos. And they just couldn't imagine it, and people just could think of personal computing, what a person could do with all of that. But he said that it was essential to co-evolve our human and tool systems. And that's what we're on the cusp of now, is co-evolving our human systems to begin to work in networks so that we can handle it, you know. Somebody once asked me, how do I keep up with all the things? And I said, because I'm part of a network. If I need to know something, I know who to go to for that. And I think we will move much more into that kind of mode where it's not just I know them personally, but I know how to get to them.
Enrique, do you
Yeah,
have
I mean, building on what Markus just said, and I fundamentally agree with all, still we have to consider the role of governments here. We haven't talked about it, and it is so difficult in the internet era, in the digital era, because I mean, internet in its all nature is a network extraterritorial. So I mean, there is no sovereignty of the countries there. Governments have very difficult the possibility to enforce any strict rule by itself. It's a free territory, the internet, which is fundamentally good, but it also creates a problem of legitimacy, and we need to address that point. And the second issue that addresses, I mean, it's sometimes difficult, and we've seen fierce reaction by governments to certain internet leaders coming to countries and saying, I want to make this world a better place. Well, present yourselves to the elections, because around here is the government and the Congress and whoever who needs to decide that. So that's a problem. And the second, And the second problem also from a business more commercial point of view is the creation of an unlevel playing field. So companies in different geographies and regions in the world abided by different rules, and that makes competing quite difficult. I think those are the issues, and if we put that together with the characteristics that Christian just said about data, imagine the challenge that we have ahead. Obviously, I don't have the solutions I would have had, but obviously I think that is also important, and we need to address that particular issue when assessing the importance of each of the players in this debate.
Excellent. So I'm going to open it up for questions now from the audience. First here, where's the microphone? Oh. One here. Gentleman in front. And then there's a lady behind for the next one.
So thinking in concrete terms about how policy can play a role in giving people more control over their data, it strikes me, and it was actually some time I spent at OECD, we did some research around intellectual property rights. And one of the findings was that, copyright has existed for a long time. Most people, when we surveyed them, didn't realize it's automatic. When you write something, it's automatic. It strikes me that, we have the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, so there's been some reform. You could debate whether it's good or bad. What role do we have in adjusting or applying intellectual property rights, specifically copyright, in a digital age so that people actually own the data that they have and they have a legal title to it? That might be a question more for Christian. but I'd open it to the panel as well, because it's a clear legal mechanism that could be used.
So what you're talking about there is individuals having copyright over their own data, having IPR over their own data.
Exactly.
And asserting that. Christian, did you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting thought, and I think this is probably where we definitely also need to think a little bit more about that, because currently copyright doesn't really include and protect factual data. You have in Europe, you have something like a database directive that would include and protect data and the collection of data. But as you may know, or as you know, copyright always requires some kind of human creativity behind the assembly or the creation, so some kind of act of creation, and it's difficult to argue that this would be the case in terms when it comes to data. And the other challenge that we also have is if you think in particular of the European context, where privacy, the right of privacy is seen as a fundamental right, a kind of fundamental right. This is not really in line with the idea behind copyright, which is primarily about protecting the interest and in many cases the economic interests of the creator. So there are some misalignment or conflicts, if you want, between those two ideas of copyright on one hand and privacy protection on the other hand. But I think there are some interesting way to think about this in order to think what would that mean for ownership when it comes to personal data. Although I can also highlight many studies that have, and including ours, that has highlighted that ownership concept of personal data is very difficult really to implement. Given that you have many, many different actors involved when it comes to the creation and generation of personal data. So it's not only the individual data subject that is involved, but very often it's obviously also the corporation that has built a whole system around the generation and the creation of metadata around the primary data. So even if we would accept to implement something like a copyright system for personal data, we would kind of face key challenges here. But this shouldn't discourage people and researchers, including ourselves, from thinking about what that would mean. And this is something that we are considering as well. I'm not sure if I answer your question perfectly, but I've done my best to do so.
Thank you, Christian.
I want to jump in. So Vint Cerf has very deftly helped to steer the movement of the internet into a global infrastructure, and he has something to say about this. So there are 7 desirable properties of the people-centered internet, and the last one, number 7, is this. Personal information in the digital environment is protected by the law and controlled by the individual. He does not use the word intellectual property because we have to be careful where we fight our battles. Intellectual property has a lot of baggage. What we do want is certain things which are that our information is protected and that we have control over it. So that's how we're proceeding forward in the people-centered internet.
I would just like to add that I'm not an intellectual property lawyer, so I'm just speaking purely from a hypothetical and conceptual viewpoint about what it means to own your data and to control your data. And I think one concern I would have is how does that impact that idea? How does it impact the ability of others to use your information or things that you do to benefit society, to analyze a new medical situation or a new remedy? I mean, what does it do if you're able to withhold that information from a beneficial purpose that would not harm you? So the concept of owning your data is, I think, problematic for a number of reasons, just on its face. I think, I'm speaking for myself here, not for my organization or our members. I think traditionally, the person who learns something owns that. That's sort of a natural state. Now, if we flip it now, perhaps for good reason, that giving me control over everything I do and that relates to me could create some friction at a very basic level. And I think we just have to think through that, what the implications are in specific contexts.
Enrique, did you?
No, I mean, just for this is not an answer to your question, but let's think about collecting societies in the field of personal data revenue generated, or how different it is for an issue, an asset of your personal, considered as personal data, which is your image. Once you have, for example, a contract of cession of those images to, for example, sportsmen, to sports brand, and how that creates, the right to be protected under just a commercial agreement, and nothing when you don't have it. But it's the same personal data asset. This is not to respond to your question, but all the issues that may be created if we enter in that particular issue of equiparating personal data and intellectual property.
Could I add something very briefly?
Yeah.
I think maybe what is also interesting as a concept to think about when we want to kind of go in that direction is maybe to think of the concept of data commons, which is interesting because it basically suggests that data isn't really owned by only one in particular individual, but this data is usually a kind of a common good where different entities or individuals, businesses all contribute and enrich the data. And I think our understanding of commons in terms of economics, but also in terms of, let's say, law regimes, are not really very sophisticated yet. And I would also suggest going in that direction in terms of research and thinking what that would mean when we apply and think about data commons as a interesting concept here.
I think this lady here. Yes. Thank you.
I'm Julia Stojanovic. I'm at Drexel University, and I'm a computer scientist. My research area is databases, data management. What I would like to bring up is an issue that was not addressed, at least not explicitly, so far today, and that is interpretability. So transparency is very much related to how well a person, a policymaker, a government can understand data analysis results. And part of this is up to the algorithm in, for example, big data applications, or up to the data collection process, or up to the dissemination process of the data. But part of this, like with beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. So users, policymakers, governments have to have the tools and the competencies to allow them to interpret results of, say, data analysis processes. So could you comment on the role of policymakers in maybe putting this on the education agenda, data literacy, data fluency type?
Maylin?
Yeah. So the US government has announced at the UN General Assembly in September the Global Connect, which is 1.5 billion people added to the internet by 2020. We realized as we were developing that together with them that it was important to have the social connection. So global connectors were essential for doing the global connect. It wasn't just getting the wires in place, because we as humans are far more complex than can be encompassed within an algorithm. There's a line in King Lear and Shakespeare, if you just look at the worth of the chemicals in a person, it's not very much, right? But we are much more than that, because we can think, we can talk, we can imagine. And so only we as humans can interpret that to the policymakers. And so Global Connect requires global connections between people. We are much, much more than the sum of our words or our writings. A lot of what we talk about in the people-centered internet is empathy and compassion and caring, and we have to make that central in addition to the data. Otherwise, we will have the best data analysis and lose our souls. So the final quote, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything you want it to confess to. So.
Did anyone else want to say something about government kind of encouraging capability, I think.
So,
oh, sorry.
This was a very interesting comment, but it's not exactly what I asked. I didn't ask about the soul. I asked about the mind. I asked about data literacy competencies, helping people understand statistics, helping people understand how the internet works and where your data goes. So we talk about computer science education, but we do not talk about data science education. So that's more of a question.
Christian, you look like you... Sorry.
Markus?
Okay.
Right.
Christian, I think you had your...
Yeah. Thank you. I would like to answer that question because it is indeed a very interesting question, important question, and there is indeed a lot to do here in terms of policy action. And the good news is that policymakers have acknowledged that there is something to be done here. I would like to share one slide because obviously one advantage of being remote is that you have access to all your slide decks. I don't know if it will work, so please let me try, please. Can you see my slide?
We can see the top left corner.
So you can't see it? Because now I don't see what you can see. Okay.
Only the top left corner of the slide, unfortunately.
Okay, let me try this one.
Yes.
Okay. Why do I show this slide? Because this is some statistic that the OECD has created relatively recently. It is based on a survey of adults in a labor market. And what they have done is they have asked workers to make basically some tests on a computer. And they have asked them to solve different problems. And one of those problems were requiring individuals or workers to use the computer, use a browser, go on the internet and do some search. So what you basically see here is findings that suggest that the large majority of people still don't have the sophisticated ICT skills or even basic ICT skills. So I think this is important because before we talk about developing some data, not only the data scientists, which are obviously the most sophisticated type of ICT skills, but even people that are aware of the challenges that comes with the use of the internet and the collection of the data, we see that there is still a lot to be done. And this is even true for an advanced country such as the United States, which is below the OECD average, as you can see here. So I think a lot of action will be required that targets primary school and secondary school in order to raise awareness and to increase the capacity of people to use computer in a way that they do not expose themselves as we see this happening nowadays.
Thanks, Christian. Markus, you had...
Well, this goes to the role of transparency in the target audience. I think the study that Christian just showed highlights the difficulty of getting in the general population up to a level where you can even begin to expect informed choices about day-to-day information use practices. So that really calls into question whether that's really the main purpose of transparency So I think it goes to, who is the right audience? The right audience has to be policymakers, lawmakers, regulators, and enforcement authorities, and they need to be informed and understand what the beneficial uses of data, the big data analytics, what happens with data, and because only when they understand what's going on can they make sensible regulations and laws and enforce these laws sensibly against participants in the economy. So I think this really highlights, that we really need to focus on what the purpose is of transparency and how to create that transparency.
And I think that's a very important question. And to be honest, from my point of view on the Telefónica, let me give you 3 examples. First of all, as you were talking about data managing competences and in general, we've ourselves found we had a serious, very serious problem on that internally. So we had a lot of people who knew how to, design, build, and manage a network, but we didn't have that many people who knew how to interpret the data that network is creating. So yes, it is a problem. In terms of policy, that brings you, one, to digital skills in general, which is something that it has been explained before, and the data, data intelligence, data managing, or whatever, the business of data and the skills needed in order to participate in that business. We, as a company, we have moved a lot of the collaborations that we have with universities all around our footprint from the traditional network skills, network managing, developing, and from telecommunications engineers, more to mathematicians, computer sciences. So moving our collaboration with universities to other fields in which we didn't have the skills. And finally, let me also tell you, building up on what Markus has said, we have a, kind of a joke. It's not a joke, it's just really serious, and something that we really want to do, but it's a joke as we express it. In terms of developing the informed choices for the customers when designing our products, we should apply the Big Bang Theory test. They should be understood by the waiter Penny, and not by Sheldon and Lerner, the computer science.
Gentleman there with the microphone. Yeah.
Yes. The question I have has to do with Singapore. I was at MTech a couple weeks ago, and they just highlighted it as an incubator for all this futuristic thinking, and they even showed all kinds of new approaches to urban living and cameras and just data that's going to be coming out of all directions. And I'm just curious how the population in Singapore is reacting to all this. We just saw a graph here showing that, nearly 50%, don't get it, 50% do. Even Estonia, which has an e-government, I was surprised to see, it looked like 20% understand the computer, but the other 80 don't, which brings the other issue, which is, okay, we're talking about privacy and control of your data, but what about the government? What checks and balances are there? So how does a Singaporean today, they're at the forefront. What are they saying? What are the reactions? What's the real people, the grassroots reaction?
I think that's why they're really interested in looking at population health science, because they're realizing that they can't explain to the regular person in the street what is it they're doing when they're actually looking at things at the country level. And working out population health science, you can kind of work out what is the data telling you, then you have to develop the right narratives to explain to people actually what that means in different scenarios. So there's actually been a big push in Singapore to scenario-based planning, so that not only can they look at different scenarios at the planning stage inside the ministries, but those scenarios then can be translated into the person in the street. There are also open town halls. The Singapore budget is on the internet. You can, before it gets finalized, you can say, well, what about we move this to that and see what would happen? You can do all that kind of scenario rollout stuff. It is very much a math and legal country, and they're really working hard to understand how better to connect on a personal level. That's probably why you're hearing that from me.
Okay, I think we had another question over here.
Yes, it was more like, hello? Yes. It's more meta comments, and I'd like to have your reaction to it. I'm a computer scientist. I work like many of these people in the trenches of the internet, trying to build tools to have things like knowing which email was used to show you an ad, things like that. Every time there's a sort of regulation panel, I'm going, I'm curious, why not? And then, I get out sort of brainstorm in my head that there's such a chasm between what we're doing, the low-level building stuff, and what you're proclaiming we should do, saving the world, empowering the individuals, have community bring together. I'm like, there's not so much we can do directly. How can we find something where what you say relates to what we can do? So. And the extreme point, you could make would be like, well, okay, we can talk, but if this chasm is not solved, well, essentially, the tools are going to only be designed by computer scientists making the next generation. And right now, we concern online behavioral targeting is important. We're going to focus on that, and then we're going to have a new thing next month. So I guess my question is, how do we bring regulatory into the language that computer scientists can do? Is there a way that you can take feasibility into account in your sort of what you proclaim we should do, things like that, so we can eventually progress together as opposed to sort of progress alone, kind of?
Markus?
Well, I think the work that the computer scientists are doing and that has been showcased here today is very relevant to the work that policymakers are doing. For example, take accountability, organizational accountability. As I mentioned, transparency is a key ingredient of creating organizational accountability and accountability to the public, and being able to explain yourself and your business practices to the public. And for that, you need relevant tools, somebody to interpret the technology and its effects to a regular person or whoever the target audience is, policymakers and experts, regulators, the population in general, or specific users of your product. So I think what you all have been doing all day here and all the work you're doing is directly relevant and connect directly to the existing legal frameworks that rely on some of the tools that you are building. So there's a direct connection. I think the main difficulty is communication, and I liked how a couple of the presenters talked about how transparency is about communication and communicating to others. So I think what really needs to happen is to communicate the kind of work you're doing to the layperson. In a nutshell, what are you exploring, what are you showing us, and what are the options based on that in plain language? But I think, so that's just one example of how this is directly relevant.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I add something?
Sure,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Christian.
I like very much this question because it actually made me realize something that I probably already had because as I may say, I didn't actually introduce myself very in detail. I'm an economist on one side, but I'm also a computer scientist. And the last comment made me realize that there is actually some key commonalities between what policymakers are trying to do and very often what also computer scientists and system designers are trying to do, which is on one hand to empower individuals. And I may say, given my experience here at the OECD, almost a little bit more than 7 years, then policies are a lot about also empowering businesses, but also individuals. But then you have also the other side, which is the role of system designers, let's say, or computer scientists, to develop systems that are kind of shaping human behavior, or the behavior of different entities. And to some extent, this is also true when it comes to policy making, which is also about designing or creating institutions that are all about setting incentives in such a way that some larger societal goods are achieved. And it's true that so far the two communities haven't really, they are talking to each other when it comes to, let's say, IT or ICT policies, or when it comes to, as such in our case, when we talk about data-related policies. But it's true that so far the communities are still working apart. And I wonder what type of way we could create, or institution we could create, to bring those two worlds together. Obviously, there is some potential there. And I would also say that maybe we should also think about how to improve our educational system, linking back to the previous question, and bringing in computer sciences also some knowledge about the potential that it has to implement law and ethics principles. And this is all about, not only about privacy by design, I think it goes beyond that. But maybe this is something we could also think about and elaborate a little bit further in the future.
I think what the internet enables is really crowdsourcing and many, many experiments. And so if we're able to, policymakers don't have enough information or even conceptual understanding about the impact of the transformation that we're actually going through now. So we have to try lots of things. You know, some people say Singapore was smart. I say they're lucky, right? We have to have lots of experiments. Estonia is trying a very big internet experiment. What Engelbart used to say is we should think of the digital frontier like the Western frontier, that nobody knew the highway to the West, right? There was lots of families and people just going out there. But what they had was trading posts and trail guides. And DTL, this gathering is a trading post. The more trading posts we have, the more we can interchange and say, okay, that way works, and there's water that. And so we have to share, and we'll get there together. And Engelbart was very, very clear that networked improvement communities was the most robust way to proceed, because you could have, you know, some very powerful person just go all the way across, right? But if we want to civilize the frontier, we have to do it together.
That's a difficult question for me to answer, to be honest with you, but for two reasons. Basically, I'm also the Chief Regulatory Officer in my organization, so I have that role within my job title and job description. But when I have a conversation on regulation with our people, for example, working in Telefónica, R&D, Nikos, Pablo, or whoever, you know, I see them always quite updated and accurate in their knowledge about the regulation that affects the product they are designing. Obviously, they normally either have access or work together with a team of people who is quite proficient in regulation provision. So I mean, for us, it's not really a problem. From a public policy point of view, you know, it is amazing, on the contrary, the level of people involved in this, engineers, computer science, basically digital product designers or digital product, that now talk with policymakers directly and not through the traditional lobbyists, like, for example, I could be. Because these guys explain things in first person, and so it's better for them. So I mean, for me, and obviously, you know, also the guys that normally in governments who will be drafting and implementing and passing the rules of the future, they feel they need to have direct contact with them and not through intermediaries. So I mean, to be honest, in my organization and the way we function, I don't really see that problem every day. Obviously, it can happen in the small businesses or smaller organizations. I can understand that, you know, for guys developing products at you know, in the old garage model, it must be difficult. You know, sometimes it's not cheap or it's not affordable to go there. In the organizations that we are, in other organizations, bigger organizations, I think that problem is not so real. But you know, my view may be a little biased, but it's the only one I can give.
We have time probably for one more question. Yes. We have a microphone. Oh, you got one.
I got one. So my name is Daoud Gordon. I run a startup in Brooklyn called 2 Cents, and our goal is personal data empowerment. So this panel is perfect for, it's fantastic to hear about what you guys are thinking about, and that people are also thinking about what we're thinking about. One of the issues that we ran up against really early on was we thought we could get some free maybe press and get some momentum by just highlighting some of the privacy scandals that we think are out there and getting people behind that sort of grassroots movement to make some changes in policy and legislation. And one thing we ran up against, and we realized right away that wasn't going to work, is because we saw a number today, $998 billion projected revenue by 2020 for personal data. I've seen other studies that say $1 trillion a year. I've seen other studies that say $3 trillion a year in revenue. And anytime there's any legislation that starts to come to the table that would enact privacy law, there's PACs, there's the Direct Marketing Association. They show up with really deep pockets and make sure that it gets watered down. And the root of it is actually they have a valid argument that if we were to enact real privacy legislation right away that really protected the individual, we would lose, depending on the estimate, a couple $1 trillion in revenue a year. That's like up to 6% of the GDP. And there's no politician I know that would actually enact legislation on their watch that would create a deficit like that. And so my question is, how is it possible to actually enact change? Or should we even be focusing on the political aspect of enacting change? Or should we try and do that from a standpoint that is more private sector or even more grassroots and just be ignoring the political aspect? Or is there something that we can do in the face of financial interest of bigger corporations than small guys like me in the public sector?
That's a good big question.
Sorry about that. That was a big one.
He should go to Europe.
He's what?
He should go to Europe.
I would, should I answer?
Yeah,
I can answer part of that.
Just move to Europe.
Yeah.
I was there. I came back.
There is a building movement among US companies even to enact some kind of comprehensive privacy law. So I don't think it's uniform, the position that we don't want privacy legislation in the US. I think there are two camps. They both have, good arguments. But I would challenge the idea that if you enact comprehensive privacy law in the United States, you would automatically cut out a huge portion of data uses. It depends on the law. And the kind of law that is possible, I think, would make beneficial uses of data possible, would enable innovative uses of data while protecting privacy. And I think there are models for that out there. If you include the right processes, risk assessments, privacy by design, accountability, that ensure that companies are accountable even as they put data to use. I think there are models that can be enacted to make that happen in the United States. So I wouldn't advise anyone to pull out of that discussion, that debate, for fear of losing the ability to use data. I think we just have to implement the right kind of law. And there are many benefits to having a comprehensive law. We could better communicate, for example, with other jurisdictions like Europe. There's a lot of friction that exists between the United States and Europe just because we don't have a comprehensive privacy law, just because our system is so difficult to explain. We have very strong privacy protections in many ways, and maybe even better than in the EU in many sectors, under the FTC Act, for example. But it's very difficult to communicate that and to get that across, and that results in friction, just like, for example, the demise of the safe harbor now is partially a result of that misunderstanding. And so there are some real advantages to having a understandable across-the-board framework for the United States as well. What that looks like is a different question.
I think Christian wanted to say something.
Yes, thank you. I think part of the problem or challenge that we face is that there is a lot of statements out there about, just to take one, that privacy would automatically kind of prevent innovation. Or that, as you said, that having a kind of sufficient privacy protection is something that would prevent businesses to really be productive and profitable. I think, part of it is obviously done in the context of, let's say, some efforts to influence policy making. I think the other part is partly explained by the fact that we still don't have hard evidence to really support the impact of privacy and privacy regimes on economic and innovation. And this is also why we are doing the work that we are doing at the OECD, in order to really have some hard facts on which to base policies, including privacy protections. I think we know that in many respects, that in order to innovate, you need to have trust, and part of the trust framework, if you want, includes privacy protection. So it's not the case that businesses need to violate privacy. I'm now very blunt. In some cases, and there are some interesting cases if you think about some interesting innovative products that have been put into the market without privacy by design or without consideration of privacy, and how badly they failed, including in companies such as, if I may say, Google. I think if you take another example, how Apple currently is building on kind of privacy-friendly products as a marketing strategy to push some of its and promote some of its services, I think the landscape is more complex than how you described it before. And I think we definitely need to put a little bit more effort to inform and to really strengthen the evidence that we have, and to challenge those people that come up with some statements that are not backed up by some evidence.
So Vint has really advised us to look at practical examples of things that work, rather than taking on the current power structures where they're strongest. So we have one of our principles, which is support locally led initiatives and grassroots innovations, as well as top-down policies and reforms to support the scaling up of promising innovations to improve human lives in diverse contexts. So what I would respond is, don't take privacy as an abstract concept. Once you start to say, here's how what I want to do improves people's lives, you are talking about more real things that people can understand. The narrative and where you decide to talk about things, many more people understand about improving the opportunities for their children or caring for the elderly and all of these things than just talking about privacy in the abstract.
Yeah, just a short comment. I mean, you may think I'm joking, but I'm not. When I tell you, I may feel a lot of solidarity with you, and that's because I've talked about it a couple of times. You know, in a competitive extraterritorial world like we are living, in which data can have the importance that has been shown. You know, it's said by some that is the fuel of the future, but with the difference of fuel, it has no end, so it has no limits. You know, for us, that work locally in different countries, normally abided not only by general rules, but specific rules that affect or restrict the use of the data generated in communication services. You know, maybe we have a different view. And as a heavy regulated company, I would not call for more regulation. But we have a similar view on how the unlevel playing field can affect your ability to compete.
Okay. So we're going to need to wrap up fairly quickly because Mei-Lin needs to rush to the airport to catch her plane. Just as our final kind of thoughts from each member of the panel, I wonder, so when we talk about the power of data, we quite a lot talk about how we should have data-driven or data-informed policy making. And if we think about the way we form our policy around privacy, we should probably have data that's informing our privacy policies as well. What are the things that the people in the audience here who are doing research in this kind of area can do to help inform the policies that are being made? Or what have you seen today that has made you think of it in a different way about what kind of policies you think we need? Enrique, would you kick us off?
Yeah. Oh, well, I think, you know, for me, when I come here and I see the things that happen around the network, it's just amazing. I mean, you know, it's difficult to understand the level of you know, data that from a single individual and from a whole community, different operators in the world of internet have, and on the contrary, how many systems, programs, products, applications are being developed in order to control that. You know, from a policy point of view, always the reaction when a stakeholder comes here and you know, and some political responsible may come here and see what people can do with the data. You know, it's just concerned probably go to their country, said, I mean, what are we doing? We should bring the data of our foreign fellow citizens to this country and stay here. You know, but that leads you nowhere. It's very difficult. We need to, so the only thing to do is to tackle the issue of developing common standard, if you want, rules, simple to apply and in protection of customers that will give citizens the power to develop to control their data. I agree with you that we cannot put all the burden, but at least we need to give them tools to at least confront providers in a common way, because otherwise it's impossible. You cannot know if the provider is coming from Singapore, if it's coming from Silicon Valley, or if it's coming from a small town in Spain. So I mean, that's the only thing I can say. We need to create that common standard rules that can be more or less valid in the different countries of the world. Otherwise, we will still be creating our closed gardens, our walled gardens that will be, you know, very easy to bypass, and the concern and the will to more protectionism will be still there as it is now.
Well, I would like to see transparent DTL as a trading post to help us shape the people-centered internet, working with the World Bank and the IMF, which are huge tranches of data, so that this could be a lab where people might get the license to, and accreditation to go in and analyze that data. When I look at the kinds of things that you all are doing, I can see how restricted you are by what data you can go after. So I would like to find ways to partner with DTL, and you should give feedback to Pablo and his crew on what we can do to create a data lab, a real data lab for benefiting humankind, so that we can do the kind of analysis that goes beyond what's the best high-definition TV I should buy tomorrow.
And I would like to echo Enrique's comment about finding commonality in standardizing some of our approaches, because what struck me today, there's so much interesting work in making data processes visible and transparent and understanding them, but it's still very difficult to understand and to bring together into a holistic whole. And I think at some point, the next step would be to bring it together into a common approach to making this visible and understandable to lay people, and actionable, therefore, in contexts where individual choice and engagement and consent are possible. So I think this has been really enlightening and amazing, and I think there's a lot of promising work going on, and a lot of things that can still be worked on going forward, I think.
Thanks, Markus. Christian?
I think there are 2 points that come to my mind. One is in terms of how the community can help in that complex, to tackle that complex problem. I think one is when it comes to the data that is being produced through the different tools that you guys are developing. I remember when we started doing some work on trying to measure the economic value of personal data, we were going out to some innovative startups that were developing some interesting products. I think one of them, I guess I can name here, was Ghost Story. Some of you know the product. It's basically a plugin for browsers such as Firefox. And we found this product interesting because it had information on how users are being tracked while they are browsing throughout the internet. And we thought that by collecting this data, by asking access to that data in order for ourselves to understand and so to inform policymakers about how individuals are being tracked, we would basically increase the awareness level among policymakers. However, it turned out to be very difficult not only to get in contact with that business, but also to kind of negotiate some agreement with them. And I think this is one of the problems that we have, because imagine that we would have to go to each single business that has information that can inform policymakers and try to negotiate some agreement with those different businesses. This is really challenging, as you can imagine. I think going towards this kind of standard, as Enrique has suggested, is probably an interesting way. Thinking about how to develop maybe some common, let's say, open data mechanism could be also another way. I think we definitely need to think about that for the future. The second point I would like to raise here is related to usability. And I think if I recap the discussion, it was a lot about can we really empower individuals to take control over their privacy? And I think this is still a question that needs to be answered and to be investigated in the future. I think one requirement that would definitely make it easier is usability, or really user-friendly interfaces. And if I may just recall a little bit of history, if you just think about what the introduction of a graphical user interface has meant for the adoption of personal computers, and basically providing, giving access to the less educated and less computer-savvy people access to that powerful tool that we all use today, you see how powerful user interfaces can be. And I think Apple has definitely shown that this is something that can really bring a revolution in the context of mobile devices. And I think maybe thinking about what this would mean in the context of privacy-friendly technology or privacy-enhancing technologies is worth thinking about.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I hope you join me in thanking all the panel and the questioners for your questions. And that wraps it up for today. Thank you.